Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Shawn Johnson-Andrews from Columbia College in Chicago joins me in examining the media industry. We discover that social media and its promise of democracy has another side. All of the postings, filmings that we put up on social media becomes monetized as metadata, and those corporations sell that data to advertisers for their own profit. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Shawn Johnson-Andrews. We're going to discuss popular culture, meaning, and power. Dr. Johnson-Andrews is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies at Columbia College in Chicago. You teach and you write on cultural studies, globalization, political economy, and your most recent book is Hegemony, Mass Media, and Cultural Studies, Properties of Meaning, Power, and Value in cultural production. We've got about 20 minutes or so we won't be able to discuss the entire book, but
sure.
Maybe we can work from the title of the book, because there's a few concepts that are expressed right in the title. And part of the question is, we live in culture in our daily lives, and we consume lots of media, whether it's television and film, and in that context, where does the meaning of what we watch reside? Is it in what we view? It is in what we're given? Big question to start with.
Absolutely. So my background is in cultural studies, as you just said, and I approach the question that you're asking about popular culture and the culture that sort of surrounds us all the time. And in this book, especially, part of where I was coming from was kind of to ask where the culture that we see around us came from, and especially why certain critics, and maybe this is stepping ahead, were concerned with commodity culture and consumer culture. What were they looking at before? Like, what was culture like before? And part of what I would separate that question into is we have processes of culture that we take part in, and we have taken part in for many millennia, or not millennia, but at least hundreds of years.
Humans have always created
exactly
culture. And if we're talking about culture, what are we talking about? I mean, when I think about earlier humans, they would be rituals like maybe dance, maybe the harvest, maybe some song that would be built from the community I live in. And so, I mean, are we talking about culture in that sense, music, art, stories?
Absolutely,
okay.
Sure. I mean, and those are the ways that we make meaning of the world, right? And they're ways that we make meaning with one another, from language to what you're talking about, dance, music, cave paintings. I mean, this is part of the human experience that we take part in, and we need to take part in on some level.
So why today, 21st century, is it such an issue, not just in academia, but even on talk shows, this question of popular culture is kind of for the masses, and then we have a different kind of culture, which might be theater or novels, and this is Marvel comics and hip-hop music, so that can't really be cultured. A cultured person wouldn't do that.
Well, and that's a question that's central to some of the early cultural studies work, and cultural historians like Lawrence Levine, who talks about the sort of divergence of highbrow and lowbrow culture, mostly in the 19th century in the United States. He opens up by talking about, for a while, Shakespeare was popular culture, right? This was something that everybody in the United States would understand Shakespeare. They might have a copy of the Bible and the works of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was popular culture, and it was something that people could kind of take up and adapt for their purposes. But then by the late 19th century, there was sort of a shearing, so that then much of the popular culture for the masses started to become mass-produced, whether it was large traveling theater companies, and eventually movies by the early 20th century.
So is this the big split? I mean, we're going to drop the word popular as from the people, and we just mean mass culture here, but is that the big split where it goes from being produced by what you and I might do, or created by my community, and it's produced by an entity that's somewhere else, the publisher of the book or the filmmaker? Or is it a removal of who gets to make
I think that's part of it, and I think that's part of the concern that people like Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School, who were writing in the 1930s, and they have their own kind of elite tastes that they're often criticized for, but I also think they were noticing that there was a shift in who could be able to manipulate and how malleable the culture was for the average viewer.
So that's when, I mean, Adorno and the Frankfurt School called it a culture industry.
Absolutely,
and so they're saying this shift is when industry makes culture as opposed to when people without an industry just in their everyday lives make culture. Why is that significant if culture becomes an industry? What changes about the meaning that might be understood or how we might interact with that culture if it's produced as an industrial production?
Sure. Well, I think there's a variety of issues that people take with it. On the one hand, if you have a culture that's sort of transmitted to your local community from New York or California or some other space, then your ability to relate to that culture is going to take some work on your part, right? And your ability to sort of see the meaning of that culture in your own lives there's some.
You're talking about this historically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but historically, because today a 15-year-old is not going to have any problem understanding the last superhero movie or the last animated feature or the next pop music of whatever genre. They will understand that. So
they've been trained. There's an education that takes years, and I have 2 kids, and I've watched them become educated.
And you set them down and say, no.
Yeah, well, they set themselves down, but there are all kinds of entities now. Marvel Comics is a perfect example. This is it starts out as something that is more organic in the sense that teenagers find it and they're interested in it and they latch onto it, and now it's the product of the Disney Corporation, right? Disney Corporation owns Marvel. Disney Corporation owns Lucasfilm, and so part of what I started looking at it, if we're talking about it from our own perspective, is how, or like today, is maybe not so much that these are kind of made somewhere else and we have to kind of shape them, but that the materials that we can shape, the sort of raw materials of our culture, in many cases are owned by an entity very far away, right?
So that raises the question of how much control or how much effect we can have on what we do. I mean, I think of if they're building blocks, it's kind of secondary to whether you and I make the building blocks or the building blocks are made by some factory that makes building blocks. That doesn't predetermine what we're going to do when we build those blocks.
No.
Is that?
That is true. No, but I think that to the other dimension of this is the kind of subjectivity that it inspires. If you aren't able to do any building, right? If you aren't able to use the media, if you can't kind of control the camera and see how this works and see what's
well, if we don't
done.
get to build the blocks are pre-shaped and they're pre-colored and we can't change it. We can't make them rounder or smoother. Just like if what I understand you're saying is we can manipulate those meanings, but those meanings are produced and distributed from somewhere else. So you and I can have an argument over what's the meaning of the latest superhero film, and we might even use some of the language and some of the mannerisms, and we can create our space, but we're creating that meaning in that space from something that we received from somewhere else?
Yes, and in addition, now as we look at companies like Disney owning Marvel, the work that we do making that meaning between us is in some ways also producing value for that company, right?
How do you mean that value?
Well, they if you look at their annual reports, if you look at Disney's annual reports, they have whole sections where they talk about goodwill, or they talk about the kind of the sort of immaterial value of these properties, and they kind of estimate them in the same way that they estimate the value of their amusement park properties.
Immaterial properties because at some point it will become material in terms of a dollar?
Well, in terms of trademarks and copyright libraries, right? So they're part of what, when Disney pays $4 billion for Marvel, they don't necessarily they don't really care about someone handing them a bunch of comic books, right?
Yes,
I mean,
right.
They could probably find
They want
those.
the identity that
want
we
the
might
identity.
have with Marvel, because then we would buy a T-shirt, or we would be predisposed to come to the next movie because of the goodwill that was
Sure.
created, or the attitude that was created.
Or you
before.
might want to walk into your local Target, and it's plastered everywhere now.
Yeah,
The licensed merchandise from these
Okay.
products, so that it sort of populates our everyday lives now. So that we're encouraged to invest our time, our energy, and our dollars in that.
It sounds like
media.
a real downer, though. I mean, it's because I mean, people enjoy these movies. They enjoy these toys. They enjoy the video game. They want to be seen as the Batman of their social group. So, and there's pleasure in that.
Sure.
So, are we saying that has a downside, or there's a part of that somehow is limited or constrained, as opposed to being seen as I'm constructing my identity or my relationship by using the material that is available?
I guess it is sort of a downer,
Okay.
but I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't have that pleasure. We shouldn't take that pleasure. I'm more calling attention to the fact that we now as we create that pleasure, as we create that meaning, it also is helping to create value
Right.
for
Somebody else.
for someone else,
Yeah.
and that that there's that's a situation that we live in, and we should kind of acknowledge that and understand it, and consider if that's the way that we would like this to work, right? And part of my interest is in thinking about the advent of new digital technologies that would make it possible to completely remake these,
right.
to take that pleasure that you get from a Marvel comic, or from Star Wars, especially after the
Well, the vision would be that as much pleasure as I may get from this story or this character or this meaning, that's fine, but it still is a restriction on what possible pleasures, meanings, characters to it, so there's no space for any other alternative view.
Sure.
That would be one way of...
And that was one way, especially in some of the early cultural studies work, kind of took this and was trying to kind of map it out by watching television programs, watching especially news coverage of industrial disputes and things like this, and say, well, it's clear that there's an ideological through line here that is being transmitted.
Yes.
All right, and so then the question is, well, is that being received in quite that same way? And there's a variety of work around what are often referred to as active audiences, where people went and surveyed viewers or did reading groups with readers of novels, and kind of asked them what their interpretation of this book was, or asked them what they did with it. And many of them turned it around and had very different understandings of that text than the interpreter might have had by just looking at the text and kind of reading off from it the basic ideology that was inherent in it.
So I'm reading a book or I'm watching a movie, and the movie is suggesting to me that I should be self-centered, I shouldn't be part of a union, I should be content with my space in life because there will be some reward. But just because I watch the movie doesn't mean I don't join a union, I don't go on strike, I don't challenge the depiction of gender or race just because it's been repeated in the movie. And so I may watch the movie and come away with a different understanding.
Absolutely.
Is that the argument?
Well, and in some cases, so there's the question of how we decode that. Right, and then we could have different positions from which we decode it. We could just completely accept that dominant encoding of the message of the ideology, or we could negotiate with and say, well, some parts of it are right and some parts of it are wrong, or we could yell at the TV, which is a frequent thing.
Well, go ahead. No.
And the other thing that especially in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of ethnographers and other kind of cultural critics who were going around and seeing audiences not just sort of have alternative interpretations kind of on their own, but creating whole communities of fans, creating whole communities of viewership where they took those texts and did radically different things with them in terms of making fan fiction or sort
What's the contemporary one with the My Little Pony? There's a
sure,
bronies.
the bronies,
The bronies.
right? Yeah, so there's there's all kinds of strange things around that
Right.
subculture as well,
Yeah.
And different forks, but yeah. So
The interesting thing for me is, and it's the third theoretical part that you have woven into your book and some of your work, is to move from the active audience and to understand that people may not just be overwhelmed with whatever they've watched on the screen, but their daily life experience may contradict that, so they can make different readings. Suggests that we're not just subjected to whatever we hear and see and we automatically respond, but our daily experience may affect those meanings. So the active audience bumps up against that because it strikes me it may not be so much a critique of media as it is a critique of how we see human beings only subjected to the media.
Yeah, no, and the political economy.
Yes, the question is, yes, go ahead.
And so one of the next steps in the sort of theoretical trajectory is for political economy scholars who were maybe initially saying, well, this is all about ideology being transmitted.
The media is going to have this effect and there's not much that can be done with it, and they see that the active audience, that's not true, but that doesn't mean you've left the idea that the structure or the production and distribution doesn't have an impact. So that political economy perspective comes back in a different way?
It does, and the thinker that I kind of jump off of, and that there's quite a lot of work being done on Dallas Smythe.
Yes.
As a theorist, especially in relation to kind of digital communication and digital labor, and we can talk some about that. But he has some theories that are being kind of reappropriated around the audience, basically creating value for the.
Well, let's stop, because the way I understand Dallas Smythe is one of his arguments was that television didn't just produce TV programs or advertisement, but the television network also produced audiences, which were then sold to advertisers. And that was the primary reason.
That's the commodity that they produce.
So the audience was a commodity. TV network would sell this. I've got 3 million viewers. I'll sell them to you. You're selling a consumer product, and you will give me money because I'm delivering viewers to you. In that sense, the audience is a commodity that's been produced elsewhere, partly by their own participation. So my question is how does a digital world or the digital communication change that place of the audience, that they're a commodity, to become something different?
Well, I think there's a variety of different ways that it's being changed by different branches of this sort of new digital culture industry, right? So there's certainly instances like, as we were talking about with Disney earlier, so Dallas Smythe's model is premised on there being kind of a commercial television model, right? And so it's between the commercials, you're producing the audience for the commercials, right? And now that's kind of been wrenched out of that commercial television model, and so that
with what model do we have?
With a model that's much more mobile, right? So that you may not sit down and watch TV. You're still maybe exposed to those commercials, but that the value that's being produced around those properties is something that's done, as kind of as you hinted at, throughout your daily life. Throughout, when you talk about Marvel Comics, or you talk about Disney, or you talk about My Little Pony, you're doing something that is natural and human, and you're having a connection that you're making with another person, but you're
also producing the value
for
for somebody else.
Exactly.
Even though it has value for you, you're producing value for somebody else.
And so how do we kind of basically what's our way out of that? Yeah. And on the other hand, with the kind of more prominent digital platforms, with Facebook, with Google, part of what's being commodified is not just our process of making meaning, which is basically what's being commodified by the sort of legacy culture industries, right? They've commodified our means of making meaning by talking about these stories, the myths that we tell about Iron Man or Luke Skywalker or something. That's been commodified.
So what happens with the digital communication, and what's that? I mean, political economy speaking, what's the relationship between who owns it, how some profits may be made, who's doing the work,
Yeah.
what's being produced? I mean, how is digital communication? I realize you may be able to watch without a commercial, but other than that, what has happened?
Well, on the one hand, you can make your own media.
I can produce my
You
own
can
media,
produce your own
right.
media. It is a little more malleable in that way. You can distribute your own media. And that's not to say that anyone's ever going to see it, but it is possible, and there are instances of people being able to kind of make their own media. And that process is in some ways intercalated with this other one where you have the YouTube making sure that they have an algorithm that searches so that so that if you put up something that's owned by Warner, they won't stop it anymore. What they'll do is monetize it. Right? Warner can choose if they want to take your video down, or if they will monetize it so that they keep it up, but any of the advertising revenue that's made from that clip, they receive instead of you.
Well, when you're talking about our ability to do that, it seems like, yes, I can make a YouTube, or I can post something on Google, or I can send something through social media, but it's still not mine. I mean, it may be my video or my story, but I'm reliant upon the fact that Google will let me post it, or YouTube or Facebook will let me post it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you're posting it, you're creating value for those companies.
For Facebook,
for Google, because they're collecting the metadata. They're collecting the data about when, who you share things with, when you share it with them, where are you, what are you doing.
What value is that metadata? Okay, so they know who I am, where I live, what I'm looking at. What is Facebook going to do with that information?
Well, advertisers believe they're going to micro-target advertising to you and sort of hyper-personalize it
So Facebook
to
will
you.
sell that data to particular advertisers, or advertisers would buy that from Facebook.
Yes, and Google, which is,
Yes,
it makes a lot of products, but it has 98% of its revenue coming from advertising. And so that's mostly what it is an advertising company that is commodifying our sociality, so to speak. And so that sharing something on YouTube, sharing something on Facebook is entering another level of that process.
That sounds a lot like Smythe's argument that networks were creating audiences, only in this case audiences are creating themselves, but they don't have any control over themselves because, as you said, it gets monetized by some social media site. So I may be the creator, but I have no control over my own creation. I mean, in the term, I guess on two levels. I can create my story or my post, but the people that come to it are also becoming data that is a commodity that can be sold, and I have no control over that. Is that?
Well, that's true.
Oh, I'm asking.
I think that's probably true. I mean, we don't have a lot of data rights in the U.S. There's no data bill of rights. We don't know what should be done, what can be done. One political issue that to talk about is that we don't have a clear set of regulations around what can be done with that
Or even
data.
if the regulations are largely about we want Google and Facebook to do something, we're still giving them the control or the power, or now even the legal authority to do the things that is part of their business model.
Yes.
So, I want to, we could talk about this, we'll probably have to have you back, but I wanted to end with something that was part of your book, Hegemony, American Mass Media and Cultural Studies. You're suggesting that we can understand the current situation, including resistance to the domination of the media and the people's recognition of that, to create what you say is a more just, more democratic media culture in society. I know it's a big question to save to the end, but you've got about a minute and a half or so to tell me, what would a more democratic media or democratic culture look like? What would be some visions that you might fill in that?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't know every part of it. I think that there's quite a few movements, around copyright, especially around creating a kind of Creative Commons. So that this is a way that you can make sure that there are materials that people can share online without fear of being sued. which you see all the time on YouTube. So that's one way of dealing with some of the legacy media issues, where we need to have some set of culture that we can use and make meaning with that isn't owned by a kind of corporation. As for the kind of digital realm, I think that we're kind of seeing the pushback on that around stuff with the election, around stuff with Google, where we are asking for some sort of political solution to some of this, and that's why Facebook is getting so anxious about controlling this news feed. That they know that if the kinds of things that happened during the last election happen again, there's going to be a great public demand for some sort of regulation, and that may be the next frontier for Facebook.
I like the Creative Commons. Maybe we should have an entire session on that to supplement the several theories that you've already given us. That's all the time we have for today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Sean Andrew Johnson, for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.